Hello, good morning. Welcome back on this stage of RadicalxChange. For me, it's a pleasure to be here in Łódź and to feel a very vibrant civil society here in Poland. My name is Luuk van Middelaar, and I will be talking about European politics. And since this is a path of radical exchange, I want to talk about the most difficult thing for Brussels, which is bottom-up politics. Is it possible to have change from below? And I'm going to make the claim that it is possible, and that change is possible. Now, we have about 25 minutes, because I also should like to have some time at the end to talk with you, to hear your views and questions. And what I want to do is to tell my brief story as a drama in 5 acts. Maybe a tragedy, maybe a comedy, we can see that at the end, but it will be a drama in 5 acts. And I also thought, arriving yesterday here, that this venue was very fitting, this machine hall, because the overall title of my talk could be European Politics from the machine hall to the theater, from a technocratic space to a space of exchange between public and leaders. Now, let's start with Act 1. Act 1. The magic of boredom. And if we want to understand European politics today, we have to keep in mind where it is coming from. So a little bit of history, please bear with you. But the origins of the EU, of course, are right after the Second World War. And it was back then a technocratic project, technical, top-down. Absolutely not about radical exchange politics. It was political leaders, France, Germany, taking the initiative. Now, why was it technocratic? That was a political choice, a free and smart political choice. Because in a way, Europe, the whole continent, from Spain to Poland and Russia and further, Europe had suffered from an overdose of politics, an overdose of drama and passion, nationalist wars, etc. So what these post-war leaders designed was a new recipe, and you could call it depoliticization. Take the politics out of politics. Make it boring, technocratic, so that people lose, in a way, interest. It was a way to calm the moods. And what they did, of course, in practical terms, was start building a market, the European market, with a lot of rule-making, for which you take a lot of time. And the action was taking place backstage, as it were, in the wings. There was no public stage. It was a rule-making factory. It was a machine hall in Brussels. And the negotiators in those days, we're talking 1950s, 70s, 80s, 90s, they knew that they could do their work best out of public view, away from the cameras. And there, Europe has its origins away from the public. And the magic was that it did work at that time to create a European Union and to increase prosperity, for instance, and to create more predictability and better relations between member states like France and Germany. Now we get to Act 2. And I would call it, the public says no. The public, you, get suspicious. And you say no. And that happens when history again takes a turn, 1989, the end of the Cold War, here in Poland, Hungary, the fall of the Berlin Wall. And in those years, there is a transformation of Europe. The old market community becomes the European Union of today. It moves eastward. The euro is made. Foreign affairs, defense, citizenship. And all this was happening with the old system, the backstage system. There was not a proper stage. And the public, the voters, smelled it. Get suspicious. Wait a minute, this is no longer a rule-making factory, this is real politics here. And what you then see is a series of referendums with no votes. People, the public, saying no, starting in Denmark in '92. And then in France was also a referendum in those years, 1992, which French President Mitterrand scraped through 50.5% of a yes vote. In France they call this le petit oui, the small yes. And other no votes back in 2005, and that time Poland had already joined. Now, political scientists call this old system where everybody, this magic of boredom, they call permissive consensus, meaning basically the people didn't care so much, citizens didn't care so much, they just let it go. They made jokes about silly rules from the bureaucratic machine, hold the technocratic space, about curves of cucumbers or bananas, about ridiculous administrative red tape, but overall it was okay. And then this second act, when the public starts suspicious, political scientists, very tellingly, they call this constraining the senses. So they see that the public is not happy, but they reproach the public almost to pull on the brakes, because the public was not supposed to say no. But I think we should see it that the public wanted a say, wanted a visible stage. Now, we're going to Act 3, and there things start speeding up and getting more exciting. Again, it is history, it is events in the world around us driving the plot. From 2008 onward, we have a whole series of crises engulfing the European Union. There is economic and financial crisis after Lehman Brothers, Euro crisis. There is a migration crisis, 2015-16. There is war between Russia and its neighbors, also starting in 2008 with Georgia, Ukraine, 2014, and of course, now there is Brexit, there is Trump, a whole series of dangerous situations, threats. And European politicians, they had to act urgently. They could no longer rely on their rule-making capacities of building this web where political passions could be smothered and where they could take years to negotiate about food security or about VAT or about the price of wheat. No, these were crisis moments of immediate action, of improvisation. That's the key word of Act 3, of improvisation in times of danger. There's one moment which I remember very well. I am an academic, an observer, commentator, but I've also been inside the EU political system as an advisor to one of the EU presidents between 2010 and 2014. And in 2010, Greece was about to go bankrupt. I was working in those days for the chair of the European Council, the man chairing the EU summits, Herman van Rompuy. And he was frustrated, and because there was nothing the EU could do. But then French President Nicolas Sarkozy said, "We have to act. Herman, il faut agir." Merkel, always the prudent German leader, said, well, there's not so much we can do. But it is true, we have to take responsibility. And there was a moment in May 2010 when leaders had just 3 days and nights to find 500 billion euros. So there was a matter of speed there, of immediate action which had to be taken. And I imagine, I'm just like you, I'm reading about this in the newspapers, but that such hectic weekends and decisions at summits between leaders and ministers and commissioners and parliamentarians have also taken place this year. in 2022, after the 24th of February and Russia's invasion of Ukraine, and decisions on sanctions, on deliveries of weapons, on solidarity with refugees from Ukraine. There too, you cannot wait and spend months and years of negotiation. It was a matter of immediate action. And what we see in my analysis, as a result of these 10, 12, 15 years of improvisation, a profound metamorphosis of European politics. This old machine hall, the Brussels rule-making factory, is transforming into a political union also able to engage in events politics, in dealing with danger, with certain threats, to act more speedily, to improvise. And in those situations, there is no treaty, no scientific evidence you can point to, no script, no scenario. Leaders have to convince you, as it were, the public, of what they are doing. And when I say European leaders, I'm not only talking, or maybe not even in the first place, about the people in Brussels, in the Commission, in the Parliament, but I'm also talking about national leaders jointly. Presidents and prime ministers from our 28, 27 member states gathering at these EU summits and jointly taking responsibility for the situation. Now, what about the public? What about you? What about the voters, citizens in those crisis years? Yes, we also noticed that this crisis politics was no longer a matter for indifference or suspicion, but of passion, emotions, because the stakes were so high. It was about billions of euros or painful reforms in the euro crisis. It was decisions about identity, sovereignty, culture, religion even in the migration crisis, about war and peace, like now. And those matters, you can no longer use that old trick of the machine hole of depoliticization. They require political persuasion, and for the public, they also realize that there are real choices made and that you have to be able to influence these events. The public also took to the streets in those years. There were demonstrations against austerity policies, about the rule of law in many capitals of Europe, from Athens to sometimes Madrid, Rome, or Budapest. National leaders in these years also discover that there is such a thing as a European public sphere, that there is, at certain moments, a pan-European theater emerging. For instance, Angela Merkel, she is not then only was a German leader, but she was portrayed in the press in Southern Europe with nasty cartoons. They were also and held responsible by those public opinions as well. There were also cunning leaders using that new emerging European political sphere to find support abroad. Hungarian Prime Minister Viktor Orban, he positions as a bulwark of European civilization in his fight against migration, not only as Hungarian, but also as nationalist European leader. Also leaders from Greece, like Varoufakis and Tsipras, they staged themselves as an alternative. So this is new, but the public was still mostly reactive to that, sometimes in opposition. And that changes, ladies and gentlemen, in Act 4. Act 4, you see there's a chronology here. Act 4, I would call pandemic solidarity. It is the moment of the COVID crisis, the COVID-19 moment. And there are a lot of earlier developments come together. We could talk a long time about everything what happened in those 1-2 years of COVID within the European Union. I wrote a book about it even that has just been translated into Polish, European Pandemonium. But here we just spend 1 minute on it. To say that, of course, this was a bleak moment, a moment of risk and danger for the European Union. But what interests me, that COVID first hit Southern Europe, Italy in particular. February 2020, remember those early days when we didn't really know what was going on. It went from China to Iran, somehow to northern Italy. And Italy asked for help. Italy wanted solidarity from the rest of Europe in terms of face masks and respirators, and later also financial help because of the impact of the crisis after the lockdowns. And then, interestingly, the Italian public, Italian local political leaders and politicians appealed to the rest of Europe directly. They even put an advertisement in a German newspaper to say, you need to help us. We are in this together. What is happening here in Italy should be a matter not just for us, but a matter of common European concern. And also in COVID, public opinions, and no doubt the same happened here in Poland, they started looking what their neighbors were doing. Because everything was so uncertain, no single government knew at the beginning what the best response was to this crisis. Should we wear face masks or not? What about vaccines? So people were watching their neighbors. But within the European Union, we also realized, damn, it matters what happens next door. The vaccine policies, as long as we have free traveling within the European Union, it matters if somewhere they take Chinese or Russian vaccines and we don't want them. And it matters if Germany gives a lot of state aid to its companies, and in Italy and Spain we cannot afford that. Just like today, by the way, with the energy package in Germany, which has been a major topic of discussion at this conference I noticed yesterday. So there is, again, this European public sphere emerging at that moment, a moment that we share. And political leaders also realized it, and in particular Angela Merkel, her again. She realized, ooh, what's the public outcry from Italy and Spain in particular. There is old resentment and frustration from the Euro crisis mounting to the surface, and we have to do something. We have to make a move. And to cut a very long story short, two very far-reaching decisions European leaders took are a response to that public outcry. One, to buy jointly vaccines, to purchase them jointly. Revolutionary decision, knowing that at the start of the crisis, public health was not even supposed to be an EU competence. But also the economic response, very ambitious, with the famous EU Recovery Fund, and its also much discussed rule of law conditionality, was a direct response to that public outcry. So here we finally have a kind of bottom-up politics in the pandemic, thanks to a vibrant, at that moment, European public sphere. And it is a big difference with the previous crisis. If I think back, and I told you I was there, to the moment of the Euro crisis, this was really top-down affair. It was economists and central bankers talking to government leaders, to presidents and prime ministers, and saying, you have to take action, otherwise our economies will collapse. And these political leaders, they had to convince very reluctant parliaments in Berlin, in The Hague, in Helsinki, in Madrid, in Athens, to take very difficult measures. Really top-down. But here it was bottom-up. It was the public pushing for action. Now, and what I find interesting is that sometimes people say there cannot be a European public because we do not all speak the same language. We are all in our national public spaces, and of course we can have translation and interpretation and headsets. But I think this argument is nonsense. I think the public is more than people reading the newspaper or voting every 4 or 5 years. the public, the audience, is also us collectively who mutter and grumble and who weep and clap and applaud and hiss and say boo, and who can realize when things are going in the right or in the wrong direction, protesting, waving flags, etc. And this public asks a role on the stage. And that is new. And personally, I'm very much always inspired by reading John Dewey, the American philosopher. And those of you who are into philosophy, I highly recommend his book, The Public and Its Problems. It's 1927, but the first 3 chapters are just fascinating and help us to explain how it is possible that the action can come from the public, from you. Because, of course, Dewey knows very well that most theories about where the state comes from, it's about top-down, it's about founders, strong-willed men. Think about Machiavelli, Hobbes, Locke, founding a political order. But John Dewey says, well, that may be true in certain days, and certainly also at the early days of the European Union, I would add. But there are moments when the public forms itself as a response to shared events. When people realize, you in the room, and I could sit with you, that things that are happening, it can be a natural disaster, it can be decisions taken in the economic sphere, affect us all, that they are a matter of common concern, that they are in Latin a res publica, a common affair. And then we organize ourselves and send representatives into the field. And then, John Dewey says, something with the traits of a state comes into being, or a political order, maybe is a more neutral term. So that's Act 4, bottom-up politics. Pandemic solidarity as a result. Very fascinating, unpredicted by all the analysts. Because the public very often knows better than the politicians and the commentators. Now Act 5, and I will conclude briefly, so we do have some time for 2-3 questions. Act 5, today, a family during the war. The Ukraine war moment. Again, a moment of history on the run, a moment of drama, a watershed moment. The outcome, of course, is open. This 5th act is open. There is no curtain. But we have a few experiences here too. We all realize, not only here in Poland, that Ukraine is a neighbor. It's a neighboring country. Also people in the Netherlands, Belgium, France realize Ukraine is part of a European family. And actions have been taken to make that visible, opening the door of the European Union in the future to Ukraine, staging a meeting of the big European family of all European states last week in Prague, 44 European states. But also the European public at large voting for Ukraine at the Eurovision Song Festival. That is also a sign of a public sphere and solidarity, and no doubt the discussion in the autumn and winter ahead will be about also solidarity among ourselves as Europeans in energy and cost of living. So to conclude, the European Union started as a machine-hall technocratic space. But after all these events and crises, ending in this war, we now have more and more often moments, of course not all the time, but moments where we in Europe realize that we share a stage, that we are a community of destiny. And I know many of you here at Liberté are of that same conviction that we can shape that outcome and that we have an impact on political decisions if we organize ourselves as public. And that's why I wanted to share with you that even for something as far away as Brussels politics, those moments exist. And I am convinced that there will be more and more of them. Thank you. Let me change the scene here. So there's space for 3 minutes of questions, if they can be brief. There's Alberto there, if I recognize you well. Alberto Alemano, let me introduce you. A professor of public policy based in Paris and in Spain. Please, Alberto.
Thank you, Luuk, for depicting so clearly and in an evocative way, the different phases of European integration, how it has evolved, and how, in particular, under your phase number 4, we could see the emergence of a European public sphere that is somehow driving the political decisions taken in Brussels. And I agree with you, this is new and is a bit of a Pandora's box. We don't know exactly how much more this could lead. Contrary to you, I don't necessarily see all the conditions met to see this public sphere being able alone to drive the next stages of European integration, including the current one, the number 5. And in particular, I refer to some structural limitations of the way in which decisions are taken in Brussels and how they can respond to citizens' input. I'm referring here to the lack of a European political space, meaning the ability of European citizens to read what their European leaders are doing in Brussels as compared to what they do at the national level. Do you see hope for an acceleration of the politicization of European issues that might lead to Europeanization of the political conversation in Brussels so that citizens can really understand where their leaders stand on? Thank you.
Thank you, Alberto Alemano. Yes, I see hope, I see movement. Of course, I see the glass half full. Huh? You can also say it is still half empty. But I think there is movement, for instance, because of the press, the media, who are more and more also in Brussels looking what the others are doing and asking questions also across borders and holding leaders to account. So that, I mean, you're right to make the distinction between the European public sphere, which emerges from time to time, and the political sphere, which needs maybe further consolidation. There are no straightforward answers, there are no magic bullets, but I do think that with events unfolding and the pressure of public scrutiny and democratic accountability will continue to increase and will have, as during the pandemic, may have unexpected consequences that you and I had not foreseen and yet that emerge. Very brief last question.
I want to ask you to move from a speechwriter to the scriptwriter role and how you imagine the act number 6 of this tragedy or drama.
Well, that's not from speechwriter to scriptwriter, but from historian to the crystal ball, right? Well, I think act number 6 will be more and more about how we Europeans deal with the outside world. Not just Russia, which is, of course, very high in our minds today, but also the global great power game between China and the United States. That will have an impact very soon also, not just on our security, but on our industries, on our jobs, about our privacy. And I think in that global context, again, there will be moments where we Europeans realize that we are in this together on this small continent, that we share something, that we are a community of destiny. And again, I think it will be history, that of act number 6, which will drive home this realization. I'm afraid we have to stop here, because there are other great speakers eager to take the floor. I will be available at 12, still for a little bit, in the coffee area if you want to further discuss informally. But I now hand over to the next speaker. And again, thank you for the questions and for your presence here this morning. Thank you.
There is like one and two. Hi everybody, it's great to be here with you this morning. I'm Stav Shaffir and I came to talk about the future of democracy as it can happen through our cities. And I'll start with a story. Exactly 10 years ago, something happened in my city, Tel Aviv, that felt like a miracle. I saw my city wake up into the biggest protest movement we had ever known, bringing the entire country to action. It started with just a bunch of tents we placed in a central boulevard of Tel Aviv. We were university students who worked very hard, but still were struggling to pay our rent. And we demanded a change for sane living conditions. Within a month on the street, the protest grew to nearly 1 million Israelis in a country of 9 million people who together protested for social justice. From a protest that was focused on housing prices, it grew to become a protest about our home and what our home, our beloved country, is supposed to be. We demanded to get our country back on track, to get it back from corrupt leaders, a country based on democratic values. For many of us, it was the biggest spark of hope we had ever seen. Finally, citizens all over the country were rising and demanding to take back power. They wanted to get involved. They organized community gatherings and brought in experts and discussed solutions. They organized. The spirit of change is what pushed me to run for politics when I was only 26 years old. I jumped into the elections with no money, no resources, no political experience, but with hundreds of volunteers to back me. Our combined power won me a seat in the Israeli parliament, the Knesset. I was the youngest woman to ever get elected, and part of a generation that usually distances itself from politics, feeling it's too corrupt, too disconnected, impossible to really influence. I wanted to prove otherwise, but when I finally entered politics, I realized the situation was much worse than I imagined. On my first day, I sat on the Finance Committee, the place where the most important decisions are made about our state budget. I wanted to find out what our government was actually doing with our money. And there I discovered that the entire budget that the parliament passed annually, democratically, was fake. In my country, we were constantly being told there was just no money for education services, for healthcare services, but we didn't know that just after the budget was passed, politicians were moving billions in public funds from the approved budget to special interest projects, often ones that benefited them politically and not the public. I discovered all of that almost by chance. Just days after the annual state budget was passed in Parliament, the Finance Committee was called for an urgent, secret meeting. It was in the middle of summer recess, so half the members were not even there. We received a big pile of papers that we never saw before, and the chair of the committee asked us to vote immediately. Just imagine yourself getting this pile of papers with a lot of budgetary tables and being asked to vote immediately without reading the numbers before. Would you vote on that? So that's what politicians were doing for decades. I asked the chair of the committee, I told him we didn't see the numbers, can we just have a look at them before we get to the vote? And he looked at me and just waved with his hand and said, it's just a technical thing. Don't worry about it. We vote and we go home. I looked at the papers. There were budgetary tables, with the first one showing a cut of 250 million shekel cut in public education. The second one was about cutting 300 million shekels in public transportation. And it went on and on. Till the last page, there were over 10 billion shekels cut in the budget, and the public had no idea that all of this was happening at the committee. Most of the politicians didn't know about it either. And even those in the committee, those who needed to vote and approve it, were ready to raise their hands without knowing what they were voting on. I asked the chair to give us a few more days to just read through the numbers and understand the vote. A bunch of older members of the committee, the more experienced ones, told me, what do you not understand? That's what we've been doing here for decades. Just vote and shut up. What I needed was an army of investigators. So I did what any sane person would do. I just uploaded all the information we received to my Facebook page. And I asked people to come and help me. Not surprisingly, People were actually really curious about those little figures. So many young people out there are just hungry for a way to do valuable political work, but they don't get the access to it. When I started fighting against this corruption, more experienced politicians kept telling me that I just don't understand how it really works. Tried to convince me to cooperate with what they were doing. When I kept going, they started to tell me that this is going to end my political career very early on. If you touch it, it will just destroy you. And after that, when I finally exposed the real corruption behind those numbers, real and scarier threats started to come. I decided not to listen to them. What I had discovered was just too disturbing to ignore. I recruited hundreds of volunteers, and together we built what we called transparency troops. We investigated every figure in the budget, forced the finance ministry to give answers to undocumented transfers, and created online platforms for the public to see what our government was really doing with our money. What we discovered was that the government was using this corrupt system for two main reasons. One of them was to transfer funds illegally to their political cronies. The second one, to hide their real priorities from the public eye. Using that system, they could tell the public that they invest as much money as they can in improving education, for example. But in reality, they would move that money from the education system the minute they could and send it to groups that support them politically, abandoning the needs of the majority of the public. With that system, they could avoid public discussion on the most crucial issues we have to deal with and just transfer money to whoever helps their political survival. It took us a long year, but we managed to make the Israeli budget transparent for the first time in history. Fully transparent. We changed the rules of the committee. We made sure members had to learn the information before they vote and not avoid questions from the public. Today, some of those politicians who sat in the committee in the beginning are under police investigation. We made crucial steps to ensure that in the future, our money will be invested in schools, in hospitals, in public transportation, and the welfare system. All of that happened only thanks to one thing. The public got involved. I, as a member of parliament from the opposition, could not have done anything without the public participation. When I had to filibuster for hours in the committee, yes, sometimes it was even 13 hours straight, to prevent anti-democratic legislation, I only succeeded because people, real people, were there with me, spreading the facts, demanding the other politicians to answer questions, showing they have a vote and that they are going to use it. Democracy is completely dependent upon our participation and ongoing engagement. It's not about voting once in 4 years. That's if you're lucky. In my country, it's becoming once in 6 months. But it's about constantly participating, constantly being part of the democratic process. Sadly, most stories are not like the one that I just told you. We're facing today, all around the world, an unprecedented democratic crisis. It's happening slowly and taking away our freedoms, with our hands approving it. Democracies don't generally go out with a bang. When they fail, they tend to do it very, very slowly. Slowly but surely, we see our personal rights disappearing. We see corruption rising as a government culture. More and more freedoms are being taken from us. Our privacy, our freedom of expression. We stop discussing politics publicly. We start thinking more before we talk about our political views at work. Our media systems try to entertain instead of giving us the real news and facts. Artists are afraid to speak up. Times of crisis, like terror, like global pandemic, are used manipulatively for taking even more of our freedoms. We saw this just recently with COVID-19, where many governments curbed the power of parliaments on the pretext of efficient and speedy decision-making, and widened surveillance powers of security services to monitor the population. Bureaucracy increased, and transparency in decision-making evaporated. Even at times of crisis, that's not how it's supposed to be. Moreover, in a time where technology was supposed to show us the path into greater freedom, we're actually going backwards with that kind of leadership we choose. Populist groups are on the rise. Democracy is based on the idea that even while disagreeing with each other, we all play by the rules of the same game. We all respect the rules of the game. But those populist groups don't care about the game at all. They want to tear it apart. And for the others, from left or right, it's very hard to play against a candidate that doesn't accept the rules at all, that doesn't have any moral limitations. Democracy also lost its power because it didn't progress fast enough to cope with the pace of our advanced technology. While we grew up as a generation that believes that all knowledge and information is in our hands, our democratic systems stayed very much behind, not transparent enough, not communicative enough. They behave like they still belong in another century, while we, the people, already expect something completely new. When the public discourse becomes focused only on creating internal enemies, on fake news, and very simplistic answers to the world's most complicated questions, it is very hard for the democratic forces to create a meaningful discourse. They begin to lack the vision and the confidence to see what lies ahead and to find out the best ways to deal with it. The public becomes tired and falls into despair. Look at the numbers. Just recently, in the elections in Italy, where a far-right wing party won, only 63% of voters actually voted. Where were the others? What are they thinking about the future? What are their intentions and political views? Same thing happened in Britain a few years ago. The Brexit referendum that was decided on a 52 to 48% margin. Only after the polls closed, many people started to understand what they were really voting on. Do you know that the second top question in the UK on Google the day after Brexit was, what is the EU? If our democracies aren't tempting enough for us to even participate, or not based on real facts, knowledge, and education, we're in a very big problem. A few years ago, I got to see a completely different story, and it happened far away in Medellin, Colombia, a city that was occupied with crime and fear for years. Every year, thousands of murder cases on the streets occurred. You can imagine what kind of society it creates. Society surrounded with walls and security guards. Out of that chaos, a new municipal leadership began to act. One of the beautiful ideas they implemented was participatory budget. 10% of the municipal budget annually was moved into public hands when the poorest neighborhood got the majority of that budget. That neighborhood in Medellin was Comuna 13, the neighborhood which in the past was used for drug dealers, where kids didn't finish high school and joined crime gangs instead, was built on a high hill. When the municipality came and claimed that that neighborhood will get money to spend on projects that they choose, you can imagine that nobody believed them, nobody trusted them. But slowly, they started to gather in small, organized communities. They agreed to sit for circles and share ideas. They could choose whatever project they liked, improving housing conditions, creating a new kindergarten or a music hall. But what they decided after a long democratic process was to build escalators. The neighborhood was built on a high hill, and for the old people in the neighborhood, it was very hard to climb every day in the hot Colombian sun, all those stairs. So they wanted escalators to be built in the middle of the neighborhood. The municipality brought the money and made the project happen, but they didn't finish it there. After a while, they announced to the neighborhood that the escalators were so expensive that they needed guards. They brought young people in red uniform to guard the escalators. But those young people were not actually trained as guards. They were trained as social workers. And what they did was not to watch the escalators. They were watching and looking after the kids. They were looking what kid needed help, in getting back to school, in avoiding joining a crime gang, in anything that happened inside the neighborhood. And those kids fell in love with the guards of the escalators. After months of making friends with them, the neighborhood changed completely. Many young people got back to school. Crime levels declined tremendously. They built a new library. All the neighbors decided to put music in the escalators and vote on what kind of music is going to be played every week. The place became happy. Sustainability was created. All the houses were painted in different colors. Trust in the municipality grew and crime levels declined. More and more young people stayed in school and received education. And these guards were their model figures. All of that happened through participation and creativity, through real engagement with real success and real hope. That's how democracy should work if it wants to succeed. Democracies thrive when they're positive, hopeful, and assured. While so many nations are slower to progress, stuck in political chaos, cities today can do so much more. Being closer to the people and to people's most basic needs, day-to-day needs, cities are the hope for democracy today. We saw different examples to that already under populist governments. When President Trump left the Paris agreements, 2,000 American cities, upon their residents' demand, joined and committed to climate responsibility. And it can go farther. If cities implement new democratic systems, technologies, and ways of thinking, they will reactivate people's minds and passion for democracy. By being experimental and creative, they can increase the most important aspect in making our world better: political imagination. Without political imagination, there will be no change. We need to imagine in order to create solutions. By making people see the results on their streets, in their neighborhoods, in their air quality and water, in roads and schools, they will start believing again that they have real power to influence, and they will use it. The ways to do it are endless. A real participatory budget made through a process of ongoing participation, learning the facts and the conditions, and engaging the public in building the projects they created in their imagination. Liquid democracy platforms, citizens' assemblies and block clubs, democratizing education in the city space to allow all students from an early age to be active participants in selecting their education programs, and allow communities to take part in defining priorities and progress in education faster than today's schools. There is no reason why those solutions should be dependent only on motivation of financial success. They can flourish and be built with public interest and support in collaborating with the tech sector for new solutions. And blockchain technology, for example, has so much to offer to the participation of the public in democratic process. But most politicians, if you ask them today, have no idea what blockchain is, if they even heard the word. Community currencies, planning collaboration, allowing citizens to help define their preferred city planning through technological engagement ongoingly. It is just insane that residents of the vast majority of cities have today no say in defining the planning of their neighborhoods, in affecting which bus lines are going to pass in their street. Because citizens know the best about the places that they live in. Imagine what would happen if they have more input and ability to take part in deciding on public transportation routes, on gardens, on infrastructure, and more. And of course, transparency in decision-making, full transparency of the budget, of municipal meetings, of political money and political donations. The only way to fight fake news and misinformation is by being open, fully transparent, not hiding, not thinking what today too many politicians think or even say, that the public is just not ready for all this information. It cannot understand all the data. That's nonsense. Democracy should start early, in schools, on our streets, in our everyday lives. The only way to make it part of our lives in a way that would make us really attached to it, emotionally and pragmatically. And it must exist in all economic levels and through all ages, including in the last tech-savvy communities. It must be based on the idea that it is our heterogeneity, our differences in a society that make our society better, more progressive and more creative. That heterogeneity is one of the things people actually look for in a city and what makes our cities better. Democracy must be made exciting again, fulfilling, and it must be empowering. With the new rise of populism that takes our societies backwards, back into darker times, many governments have lost touch with what really matters, with our day-to-day problems and fears and dreams. It is time for our cities to step forward, to take more responsibilities and demand more power, to collaborate with other cities globally, especially on the global challenges that cities have the most power to confront, like climate change, like democracy. We need to act like the leaders of our generation, in every city, in every country, in our world. We need to activate our democracies for their survival, but for our own lives. I'm sure that in this room there are many, many more ideas for how we can fix the world and make it better. Just imagine what would have happened if this room and the rest of these people in this interesting conference would come together to imagine the new ways for democracy in a city to be built and what it can make to our entire world. Thank you very much. Thank you. I think we have a few minutes for questions or ideas. Yes?
Thanks. Hi, Stav. Thank you so much for the fascinating speech. You spoke a lot about public participation and about how democracy should be rooted in data and like real information. So I was wondering what you think about this thing called participatory research. I'm not sure if like people in the room know what that is. I think it's a pretty new idea. And the idea is basically to include people we would usually study in making of that research. So for example, they would also like gather data about themselves. Sometimes they would also analyze the data about themselves. So that's a step further in how the public can be engaged. And it's debated to what extent should it be the public making that data. So I was wondering what you might think about that.
I think it's a really interesting idea. And what I'm talking about is basically about being very experimental. In order for democracy to be exciting, if we want people to participate, we need to experiment. It's very hard for politicians to experiment. Politicians are constantly looking for the fixed rules, proven rules. They imitate each other. Sadly, they imitate sometimes the worst of each other. And being experimental is scary because it shows our vulnerability. It shows that we don't know everything and that we sometimes make mistakes. And there is this fear amongst politicians that making a mistake or admitting vulnerability will immediately kick them out of politics and get them to leave their seat. But that's the kind of understanding and democratic education that we need to create. I think what's happening today, sometimes the good aspects of social media, there are many aspects to discuss, but the good aspects of it is that we do see more vulnerability. We have a much more immediate way to communicate with voters. It would be incredible when social media would be actually open source and allow us to do it more efficiently and not while being occupied with a spread of fake news. But even as it is today, we can still use it more, to use the public voice in research, in data creating, to involve it all the time while the data is created takes a lot of trust. But only by giving trust, as probably many of you know as parents to young kids, only when you give them trust, they grow. And it's part of what we need to do as a society. Yes?
Hello. Here.
Right here.
Okay. You were talking about public participation. There was a lot of imagine if, a lot of hope, and even, getting exciting about the future. But coming back to your story that you start from, as far as I know, in Israel, still the housing prices is a really big problem. And 10 years passed, and these new solutions that you are explaining here are very fascinating, but are we have time for proving this idea and really solving the social problem that we are faced with right now? Because coming back to the Israel and housing prices, the problem is still not solved.
Yes, I agree. The problem is not solved, and that's because we constantly practice the same solutions for the same mistakes for the old problems. Policy hasn't changed. The same ideological beliefs remained in the government. We had, for most of this decade, the same very right-wing government that now took us in the last few years into a long democratic crisis where we had 5 consequent general elections in 3 years. And that prevents from real solutions to arrive. It's not even discussed in the public discourse. The public discourse is mostly about finding internal enemies and creating fear. It's not a solution-based discourse. And that's why I personally developed the feeling that we need to turn our energy into city democratic building. I feel that during this chaos in many of our nations and in my society too, cities have the stability and the level of closeness to the citizens that could allow change. Today, they don't take the power into their hands. They're too afraid. In many of the cases, the same leaders have been there for over 20 or 25 years. They need a renewal. And yes, these procedures can happen for the cities. The housing crisis would be the first if municipalities take into their hands the power to implement new policies of affordable housing, in rent, in social housing, of public involvement in planning. If municipalities would take this power into their hands, they could start implementing the solutions that the government is too afraid of. We have a minute, so a quick question? Yes?
I wanted to ask you more about your tools. You mentioned Facebook, and do you have any experience with other digital-based tools that helped you to realize your projects?
Yeah, so in the beginning, when I just started, Facebook was a real important tool for me politically because I could use it to spread information that the media was uninterested in. Like everything I told you about the budget in the very beginning was just not interesting for the media. They assumed that the public has no interest in learning the gray details of the state budget. We proved through social media that the public had a lot of interest in that and wanted to get involved. They were just looking for the right tools to do it. But sadly, social media through that decade had changed a lot. The algorithms are not today free and truthful information, but otherwise. And so we started to develop other tools, like an open budget tool that opens the budget completely. We're constantly looking for new tools. That's part of the reasons, actually, I came here and why I really love the RadicalxChange organization, because I really feel we need to develop these tools in collaboration with the tech community that sometimes distances itself from politics too much, not believing in it, but instead of not believing, it is possible to get engaged in creating the change through political involvement. And I really work and want it to happen. I think our future depends on it. It can only happen through collaboration with the private sector and the public sector, with citizens that will get involved, that will not separate what they do in their work from how they behave in reality and from their values, moral values and beliefs. So our time finished, but I will be here around. If you want to share tools or hear about other tools, I'm open for the conversation. And thank you very much. Thank you for listening and sharing.
It's not always easy to recognize. It may look like this, or like this. It may be a burden, but it is a responsibility that we embrace nonetheless. But if it means this for one person and this for someone else, maybe it ultimately means being there for one another. It isn't handed to us, but we know where to find it and how it feels, how it tastes, and what it sounds like when we finally have it. It means different things to different people, but for many, it means everything. And if we all fight for it, it will eventually bring us together.
Jeszcze jedno krzesło. Jest prośba od Państwa sprzątających, żeby myć szklanki tylko w toalecie po prawej stronie, ok? I nie myć w innej, bo chyba wiecie, tę robotę. Ale to nie jest zakochane w ogóle, wszystko wytierane.
Czas, dokładnie.
Dobrze. Gdzie my to mamy? Dwie mają zostać?
Dwie zostają. Na tamtym też dwie. Tam też dwie. I karawka, jedno krzesło. Dajcie krzesło dziewczyny. Krzesło dziewczyny.
Nie potrącić.
Atlas Network is, as the name suggests, a network, and it's global. We work all around the world. We're based in the U.S. We have about 159 partners in the United States right now, and the bulk of our partners are outside, nearly 500 in total.
Atlas Network, it connects people from all over the world, defending the idea of human dignity, defending human rights and personal liberties.
Atlas Network is focusing on, I think, the most important and moral cause in the entire world.
We partner with local innovators, local leaders who understand conditions on the ground in communities facing real challenges. We look at the people from the worldwide freedom movement that are passionate are ready to make a difference, understand local conditions, and we invest in them.
At Atlas Network, we unleash individual ingenuity to enrich humanity.
The United States does not have a lock on the idea of freedom and liberty. Those ideas are beyond borders.
One of the main goals of Atlas Network is to eradicate poverty around the world, and we do that by investing millions of dollars in our partners' work every year.
Historically, wealthy nations around the world have tried to help low-income countries develop. The way we've been doing it traditionally has not really been working. So there's a movement to do development differently, and that means we need to step back as outsiders and rethink the role that we're playing in helping people in low-income countries achieve their dreams.
We want to make the world a better place. We want to make the world a freer world.
All of us want to leave a legacy and be part of something big to make a better world. This is exactly the work of Atlas Network.
With our growing number of hundreds of successful partners, we're stronger than ever.
Changing the world.
Changing the world.
Changing the world
starts together
with us.